Good morning, everyone. I am Snehal Supriya, Associate Partner, Transfer Pricing, Barish Audit and Advisory. Thank you, Barish, for providing me an opportunity to deal with uh, the most struggling issue of present UI corporate tax law, which is transfer pricing. I have been given to understand that many business houses, taxpayers, and consultants have been passing sleepless nights after the introduction of Federal Decree Law 47 of 2022. The taxpayers as well as the consultants are struggling to quantify the impact of the corporate tax law on their businesses. However, for the present discussion, for the next one and a half hour, we would be just concentrating on the provisions of transfer pricing that are provided in the Federal Decree Law 47 of 2022. Transfer pricing provisions are provided in Article 34, Article 35, Article 36, and Article 55 of the Federal Decree Law. So before we understand what transfer pricing is, let me take you to the historical background of transfer pricing. So the very first transfer pricing dispute was recorded in the year 1918 when a UK resident entity sold goods to a US company. The dispute was regarding the prices of the goods supplied by the UK company to the US company. And this led to a huge uh, discussion among both the tax authorities regarding the taxing rights of the profits that had resulted in this transaction. This dispute set the stage of global taxation, and the finance ministers and the diplomats of various countries realized that on account of the rise in cross-border transactions, the the MNC companies had resulted into harmful tax practices, which had resulted in the erosion of the tax base and tax leakages. So the G7 countries came together to form an organization for economic cooperation and development, shortly known as OECD, in 1961. The founding members of the OECD were deliberating upon the burning issue of resolution and profit shifting at that time. Upon in-depth analysis, the finance ministers and other diplomats of these G7 countries zeroed down upon transfer pricing provision which prescribed certain methods for computation of arm's length price in case of transactions between related parties. Since then, the transfer pricing law is constantly evolving. As a landmark work in 1995, the OECD published guidelines for transfer pricing, which covered the transfer pricing provisions for various transactions. And these guidelines were adopted by many countries in the transfer pricing legislations of their domestic corporate tax law. Presently, though there are 34 countries who are the members of the OECD, many countries still follow the OECD transfer pricing guidelines as a part of framing their domestic transfer pricing regulations. So this was a brief history of how transfer pricing has evolved. Now let's move on to what is the concept of transfer pricing. The meaning of transfer pricing is there in the word transfer pricing itself. When you dissect the words, you get transfer. Transfer means transfer of goods, services, intangibles, loans, guarantees between two or more parties. And pricing refers to the pricing of these transfer of goods, services, intangibles, or any other transaction. So when put together, transfer pricing is essentially the pricing of transfer of goods and services between two or more related or connected parties. So in the next part of the training, we would look at how transfer pricing affects the the tax revenues of the various governments and how the governments are tackling it. When we move to the next part, what was the rationale for regulating the transfer prices? The first and foremost reason for regulating the transfer prices was the differences in tax rate across various countries. As we all are aware, the various countries have various tax rates prescribed. In UAE, we have 9% tax rate. In US, the tax rate is around 25%. UK has a tax rate of 30%. So it was found that the multinational companies used to take advantage of the tax arbitrage between various countries by taking the advantage of the difference in tax rates and used to park their profits where the used to park their profits in the jurisdiction which offered very less tax rate. The next rationale was an inherent assumption that transactions between related parties and connected parties always have a pricing flexibility between them. The pricing between two connected parties would be guided or would be set with a preconceived notion for benefiting both the parties, and hence it was required to regulate the pricing between the two connected parties in any transaction. And the last rationale for transfer pricing was every government wanted to prevent the erosion with the tax base and plug potential tax leakages. Due to the differences in tax rates between various countries, it used to happen that the countries providing a less corporate tax rate would be earning more and more profits, or would have more taxable profits in that country compared to the countries where historically there was a high tax rate. So it was discussed among the G7 countries and the OECD members that there needs to be some mechanism in place which ensures a fair taxation right amongst all the between the countries that are party to the transactions, and it helps to plug potential tax leakages. So next, when we look at the pillars of transfer pricing, there are three basic pillars of transfer pricing present. The first one is base erosion, second is profit shifting, and the third one is arm's length principle. Base erosion and profit shifting go hand in hand. So now, what is base erosion? Base erosion is the erosion of a tax base of any country. So to put it in simple terms, when uh, any in case of any transaction happening between related parties, the country who would be having a high corporate tax rate would be at the suffering end, since none of the entities or none of the MNCs would like to structure their transactions in a manner that they earn a higher profit in the country where there is a high tax rate, and hence the profit would be shifted to a country with a lower tax rate. So the country where there is a higher tax rate, their tax base would be eroded by way of the shifting of profits from that high tax rate country to a lower tax rate country. And in this way, the base erosion and profit shifting go hand in hand. These both are the core elements to be present for any transfer pricing analysis. Any transfer pricing analysis without the element of base erosion and profit shifting is redundant and it serves no purpose. We will deal with the arm's length principle, the third pillar, later on. So let's now look at how or what is the structure of the transfer pricing provisions in the UAE. The transfer pricing provisions were introduced in the UAE along with the corporate tax law, which was announced through Federal Decree Law number 47 of 2022. As mentioned earlier, there are four articles which deal with the transfer pricing regulations in the UAE. Article 34, which provides, which deals with the prices at which the transactions would have taken place between two or more related or connected parties. Article 35 provides the conditions wherein the two or more parties can be considered as related parties. Article 36 provides for the pricing of payments made to connected parties and it also provides the definitions of connected parties. Article 55 deals with the transfer pricing documentation that needs to be maintained by the taxpayers in the UAE. So before we go to what is the UAE law of transfer pricing, there are certain questions that needs to be clarified to have a conceptual clarity of what transfer pricing is. The first question is transfer pricing applicable to all the taxpayers? Yes, transfer pricing is applicable to any form of business, whether it is a company, LLP, partnership firm, trust, or a natural person. The provisions of transfer pricing are applicable to everyone. The second question is transfer pricing applicable to all the transactions between related or connected parties? So, if you look at the second presentation which I had flashed, transfer pricing is applicable for transfer of goods, services, intangible loans, guarantees, and all kinds of transactions which affects the incomes, assets, profits, or losses of the two parties to the transaction. So the answer to the second question would be yes, transfer pricing is applicable to all the transactions between related or connected parties. Third question is whether transfer pricing is applicable only between the cross-border related parties or transactions between two domestic parties also. So initially, when we look at the history, transfer pricing was thought to be applicable only to the transactions between two MNC cross-border parties only. It was an inherent assumption that the entities or the business entities would structure their transactions in a manner in order to take the advantage of the differential tax rates between two countries. However, as you might be knowing, and we have an example of a tax holiday unit, that is a free zone concept of free zone entities in the UAE, where subject to certain conditions, the entities falling under the free zone are not required to pay any taxes, whereas entities operating out of mainland UAE have to pay taxes at 9%. So it was seen that there were certain taxpayers who used to take advantage of the beneficial tax holiday regime and used to park more and more profits into the tax holiday units and used to claim higher tax deductions in the mainland units, and hence Certain countries have also incorporated the transfer pricing provisions for the transactions between domestic related parties or connected parties also. So presently in UAE, when we look at the transfer pricing scenario, transfer pricing is applicable to the transactions between the cross-border related parties and connected parties, as well as the transactions, the domestic transactions between the related parties and connected parties also. So an entity operating out of the mainland UAE having transactions with a qualifying free zone entity would also be subject to transfer pricing analysis. Here's a diagrammatical representation of the applicability of transfer pricing. Scenario A is a case where A company, a resident of UAE, is selling goods to B company, a resident of USA. B company is a related or a connected party of A company. Yes, transfer pricing would be applicable in this scenario. Scenario B is A company, a resident of UAE, selling goods to C company, an unrelated third party who is a resident of USA. In this case, since the transactions are between two unrelated parties, transfer pricing provisions are not applicable to this transaction. Now let's move on to what is the meaning of related or connected parties. And for the applicability of transfer pricing, the existence of related or connected parties is must, without which, if there are transactions between two unrelated or unconnected parties, transfer pricing won't be applicable in any manner. So Article 35 of the Federal Decree Law 47 of 2022 provides the regulations where two parties can be considered as related parties. The article provides that a related party is an individual or an entity who has a direct or indirect relationship with a business entity to whom the corporate tax regime is applicable. This relationship can be through ownership, control, or kinship. The provisions of kinship are only applicable in case of natural persons, and it is not applicable to any other forms of businesses. The article further provides certain scenarios where two or more entities can be considered as related parties. They are that two or more individuals related to the fourth degree of kinship or affiliation, including by birth, marriage, adoption, or guardianship. An individual alone or together with any other related party who holds 50 or more than 50% in any entity or controls that entity. Two or more legal entities are being held by one legal entity, and that legal entity holds directly or indirectly 50% or greater share or controls the other legal entity. The two or more legal entities holding 50% or more share in a single entity, then those two entities would form or would be the related parties. A taxpayer and its branch would be considered as a related party. Partners of the same unincorporated partnership firm would also be considered as related parties. Trustees, founders, secretary, or beneficiary of the trusts would be considered as the related parties of the trust and the foundation. When we look at the definition of the related parties in terms of the UAE transfer pricing law, the definition has been very strictly worded, which provides a reference of control or ownership of 50% or more, as compared to the OECD transfer pricing regulations, which is very loosely and widely worded, which provides that under the OECD transfer pricing regulations, the parties would be considered as related party if they participate directly or indirectly in the management, control, or capital of an enterprise. One unique feature in the UAE transfer pricing law is that they have introduced the concept of kinship as a part of related party definition for the individuals. This principle of kinship is very wide, and it would cover up to four generations of relationship with the individual. So the generations up to the great grandparents would be covered under the definition or the ambit of transfer pricing, and a transaction by an individual with his great or great grandparent would be also within the purview of transfer pricing. One possible reason why this kinship definition has been introduced is because of there are many family-owned businesses in UAE, and the government does not wish to have any potential tax leakages out of this widely owned family businesses in the UAE. So let's move on to the next provision, Article 36 of the Federal Decree Law, which deals with the connected parties definition. Connected parties to a business is the definition or the instances have been provided in Article 36, wherein an individual who directly or indirectly holds an ownership interest or controls the other taxable person is considered as a connected party. A director or officer of the taxable person is also a connected party. An individual related to the owner, director, or officer of the taxable person, including up to the fourth degree of kinship or affiliation, would also be considered as a connected party. Where the taxable person is a partner in an unincorporated partnership, any partner in the same partnership would be a connected party or any related party of the four instances mentioned above. We will deal with each of these later in detail. So the concept of kinship is, the concept of connected parties is very unique in case of UAE transfer pricing. Most of the jurisdictions in the world do not have the concept of connected parties. One possible thought process behind the introduction of connected parties is that UAE corporate tax law is only applicable to the business houses and not applicable to the individuals. So the government the government had foreseen that post the applicability of transfer pricing regulations to the business houses, the taxable business units might make high unreasonable payments to natural person, and that would lead to the leakage of tax revenues of the government, and that's why the government thought to introduce the concept of connected parties also. Article 36 provides that any payment made to the connected parties shall be allowed as deduction only if these payments correspond to the market value of the transactions and are incurred only and exclusively for the purpose of the business of the taxpayer. To determine the market value of the transaction, the Article 36 falls back to Article 34, which says that the transaction must be priced at arm's length as per the methods provided in Article 34. And the provisions of connected party are not applicable to taxpayers who are listed on recognized stock exchange or subject to any regulatory oversight of a competent authority of any state. So this is a pictorial representation of how the parties can be considered as connected parties or related parties. We have Mr. A, who is the first cousin of Mr. B. Mr. A holds 75% in Exco. Mr. B holds 25% preference shares, but they represent 51% voting rights in Vico. Mr. C is the director in Vico. Mr. B is a 50% partner in an unincorporated partnership from PQR, and FCO is also a 50% partner in an unincorporated partnership from PQR. So when we look at the, or when we analyze the relationships between the two entities, Mr. A and Mr. B would be considered as related parties as per Article 34, as they are related to the fourth degree of kinship. Mr. A and Mr. and Exco would be considered as related parties because Mr. A holds more than 50% in Exco. Mr. B and Miss and Vico are related parties because Mr. B controls Vico. Since the holding of Mr. B represents more than 51% voting rights, the control would be there with Mr. B. Mr. A and Vico are connected parties as per Article 36, since Mr. B is the related party of Mr. A. Mr. B and PQR and FO and PQR would be related parties, since Mr. B and FO both hold 50% in PQR. Mr. B and FO, both being partners of this same unincorporated partnership, will also be considered as related parties. Mr. P and EXCO would be connected parties as per Article 36, as Mr. A is the relative of the owner of EXCO, that is Mr. A. Mr. C is a director in VICO, and hence Mr. C and VICO are also considered as connected parties as per Article 36. And EXCO and VICO, when we try to evaluate the relations between EXCO and VICO, they are unrelated parties since there exist no relationships between EXCO and VICO. So now coming on to the third pillar of transfer pricing, the arm's length principle. What is an arm's length principle? Arm's length principle is a price which is applied or proposed to be applied in transaction between two unrelated, unconnected parties under uncontrolled scenarios. The words unrelated, uncontrolled are of significant importance over here while determining arm's length prices. Article 34 provides using one of the prescribed methods for determination of arms and prices for any transaction between two or more related or connected parties. After using these prescribed methods, you are if you arrive at a single price which is an arm's length price, yes, that price would be considered as arm's length price for the transaction entered between two connected or related parties. If there are more than one prices considered as arm's length price, the federal tax authorities are in the process of coming out with a mechanism which would provide for determining an arm's length range if the price of the transactions between two unrelated or between two related or connected parties fall between that arm's length range. The transaction would be subject to the transactions would be arm's length from a transfer pricing perspective. Moving on to the next portion, the Article 34 prescribes these five methods for undertaking transfer pricing analysis and determining the arm's length price. Broadly, these methods can be divided into two buckets. The first bucket is traditional transaction methods. The second bucket is transactional profit methods. As the name suggests, the traditional transaction methods are applicable, or under traditional transaction methods, a transaction by transaction analysis of arms and pricing has to be done. Whereas in case of transaction profit method, the comparison of profitability between of the transactions between two connected parties with the transactions between two unrelated, unconnected parties is to undertaken. The traditional transaction methods are comparable uncontrolled price method, resale price method, cost plus method, and the methods prescribed in the transactional profit methods are profit split method and transaction net margin method. Article 34 provides that a taxpayer may apply any of these five methods or a combination of any of these five methods in any manner to determine the arm's length price. There is no preference for one method over another. Further, Article 34 subclause 4 prescribes a situation where if none of the five methods prescribed are able to determine the arm's length price, the taxpayers and if the taxpayers can demonstrate through suitable justification that none of the methods can be used to determine the arm's length price, the taxpayers are free to use any other method that can determine the arm's length price of a transaction. Now let's see how these methods of transfer pricing are used and where are they used. So the first method is comparable uncontrolled price method. This method is used in a situation where identical comparable transactions are available. So when we let's take an example of a life science company operating in UAE selling blood cancer drug to to its related party in UK. So while determining the arms and price of this transaction of sale of a blood cancer drug, uh, one needs to determine one needs to analyze the price that has been charged by this life science company to while selling the blood cancer drug to an unrated or a third party customer. The product comparability is must over here. So in our example, when the sale is of a blood cancer drug, you cannot compare or you cannot use the price at which lung cancer or bone marrow cancer drug has been sold. So you need to have apple to apple comparison under comparable uncontrolled price method. Now coming on to next, resale price method. Resale price method is mainly used in case of trading entities where the goods are purchased or procured from a rated or unrated parties and they are being sold to the third parties. Cost plus method is used where semi-finished goods or goods are purchased from rated or connected parties. The entity or the taxpayer does some value addition to the purchased goods and sells it to the third parties. Split method is used where there are number of complex processes involved in a transaction and it requires contributions of more than one related or connected parties in the transaction. An example of application of profit split method is development of an intangible asset. Transaction net margin method is used in case of purchase or sale of goods or services where um, an appropriate arm's length price cannot be determined by usage of any earlier four methods. Net margin method is one of the most widely used methods after the comparable and control price method. Moving next to the provisions of selection of transfer pricing method. Article 34 of the Federal Decree Law mentions that the choice and application of the transfer pricing method or combination of the transfer pricing methods should be done after considering the following factors: the contractual terms of the transaction or arrangement, the characteristics of the transaction or arrangement, the economic circumstances in which the transaction or arrangement has been conducted, the functions performed, assets employed, and risks assumed. Shortly, it is called as FAR analysis. by the rated party entering into the transactional arrangement, and the business strategies employed by the rated or connected parties while entering into the transactional arrangement. After a careful analysis of all these five factors, the Article 34 provides that the taxpayer can choose any of the method that is applicable to determine the arm's length price of any transaction between related or connected parties. So moving next to the case studies on transfer pricing, here's an example of XYZ UE which is operating in XYZ, which is operating in mainland UAE. It has a transaction of sale of tablets. 100 kgs of tablets is being sold at ED 90 per kg to XYZ USA, which is a subsidiary of XYZ UAE. And the same tablets are sold at 100 kgs. The 100 kgs of same tablets are sold at ED 100 per kg to third parties in UAE. In this case, which method would be applicable to determine the arm's length price of the transaction? It would be the comparable uncontrolled price method. Just as we discussed a few moments ago, the same product, the tablets are being sold by the taxpayer to the rated party as well as to the third parties, and hence the cup method would be the most reliable transfer pricing method that can be used to determine the arm's length price of the transaction. The next method is the resale price method. Here we have a foreign manufacturer selling product A to an independent third party in UAE at a cost of goods sold at 150. The independent third party in UAE is selling the goods, selling the same goods to at EED 200 to customer A. The cost profit margin earned by the independent third party is 25% in this entire transaction. Now, the foreign manufacturer is selling the same goods at 135 EED to the rated party in UAE, and these goods are being sold at 150 EED to the customer. Under this resale price method, the rated party should be earning similar margin, 25% gross margin, in which is being earned by an independent third party in UAE. So this is entirely how the resale price method functions. Next, we have the cost plus method. The cost plus method is preferred for manufacturers supplying semi-finished goods, and then there is some value addition being done on these semi-finished goods and being sold to the third parties, or for the companies providing services. Under the cost plus method, the direct and indirect cost of production incurred by the taxpayer plus a comparable gross profit margin, which would essentially be the value addition that has been made by the taxpayer, would be taken into the consideration, and thereafter the sales price that has been arrived after the addition of these two elements would have to be arm's length, uh, while determining the sale made to the rated or connected parties. Moving on to the next example of a profit split method, here we have YGmbH and ZINC, who have a subsidiary who hold 30% holding in X company. All three entities are engaged into development of software product. ZINC is has entered into a contract with customer C for delivery of software product. The UAE entity Exco is engaged into the software development, and all three entities, YGMB, ZINC, and Exco, are presently involved into the development of a software. While delivering the software finally to the customer, ZINC received a consideration of 50,000 USD, which was distributed within the group is under 12,000 USD was paid to Exco, 10,000 USD was paid to YGMBH, and the remaining 28,000 USD was retained by Z company. The total costs incurred by all these three entities were USD 9,500, USD 8,500, and USD 22,000 respectively. And the entire group earned a profit of 10,000 USD in this transaction. The country, based on the functions performed, risks assumed, assets employed, the relative contribution of Exco was 50%, YGMBH was 20%, and ZINC was 30%. In this case, when we apply the profit split method for determine the arm's length price for transfer pricing, we need to check whether each and every entity has been remunerated on the basis of the contribution that they have made in the entire set of transaction. So when we look at the revenue, 12,000 USD was the revenue of Exco, YGAPH had a revenue of 10,000, and ZINC had a revenue of 28,000. The costs incurred were 9,500, 8,500, and 22,000. Profits, which were initially apportioned by the groups, were 2,500 to Exco, 1,500 to YGAPH, and 6,000 to ZINC. However, while looking at the transaction from an arm's length perspective and looking at the relative contribution incurred by the respective entities, the federal tax authorities would rework the profits on the basis of the contribution that has been undertaken. So, 50% contribution was of Exco. So, out of the 10,000 profit that has been earned, 50% should be apportioned to Exco. So, Exco should have earned 5,000 profit. YGBPH share in the profit would have been 2,000, whereas ZINC's share in the profit was 3,000 USD. And when we compute the arm's length pricing, it would be the total cost that has been incurred would be 9,500 plus sorry the total revenue that has been earned by uh, the Exco would be 12,000 USD plus the incremental profit of 2,500 that was allocated. The in case of YGMBH, an incremental profit of 500 USD would be allocated to YGMBH, and ZINC will have to reduce its profit by 3,000 USD. Moving on to the next method, which is the transaction net margin method. We have X company operating in UAE which renders software development and maintenance services and provides these services to its rated or connected parties and earns an operating margin on cost. And the operating margin is 20% earned on cost. While determining the arm's length price by using TNMM, an analysis of similar companies operating in software development and maintenance services and their operating margin will be required to be done. So we have company A, company B, company C, company D operating in the UAE into the same software development and maintenance services. And under scenario one, these companies are earning minus 5%, 30%, 5%, 15%, and 35% operating margin on cost. And so the arithmetic mean of the operating margin of these five companies works out to 16%, whereas X company, while rendering the services to its rated or connected parties, is earning an operating margin of 20%. Since X company is earning more operating margin with its transactions with rated and connected parties, the transaction will be considered as arm's length as compared to scenario 2, where the arithmetic mean of the comparable companies works out to 25%. X company is earning lesser margin on its transactions with related and connected parties. So there is a scope of base erosion and profit shifting in this case, and hence the transactions are not considered at arm's length. The next question that would arise is that how do we determine who are the comparable companies? So in our example, we have considered company A, company B, company C, company D, and company E as the comparable companies. How do we determine these as the comparable companies? So there are various transfer pricing tools available in the market which help you to conduct a scientific analysis of which companies are considered comparable to your industry and to your operations. By using those tools, one can determine the comparable companies while conducting the transfer pricing analysis and computing the arm's length price through the transaction net margin method. The Federal Tax Authority is yet to notify the publicly available databases and the transfer pricing tools through which we can conduct the comparability analysis and find out companies similar to that of a taxpayer. So moving on next to the what is the process involved in determining the arm's length price of a transaction. So the steps involved are: step one, determine whether the entities are related or connected parties as per Article 35 and 36 of the Federal Decree Law. If the entities are not related or connected parties, the transfer pricing analysis is not required. Step two is identification of the transaction subject to transfer pricing. Step three is identification of the tested party. Tested party concept is not provided in the federal decree law in any of the articles. However, this concept has to be borrowed from the OECD transfer pricing guidelines. Tested party is basically the party whose transactions has to be or the transactions of the taxpayer for whom the arm's length analysis has to be done. So in most of the cases, the tested party would be the entity operating in the UAE for the purpose of UAE transfer pricing regulations. Step 4 is selection of the most reliable transfer pricing method provided in Article 4. So here in step 4, based on the professional judgment, which of the method is applicable to compute the arm's length price of a transaction would be determined. Step 5 would be performance of a comparability analysis and select appropriate comparables for determination of the arm's length price. Step 6 would be computation of the arm's length price of the transaction. Step 7 would be comparing the arm's length price determined with the actual price at which the transactions have been taken between the related and connected parties, and documenting the analysis undertaken from step 1 to step 6. Step 8 would be the preparation of transfer pricing documentation if certain conditions are fulfilled as prescribed in Article 55 of Federal Decree Law. So, one of the important condition that has been prescribed in Article 34 while selection of the most reliable transfer pricing method is functions performed, assets employed, risks assumed between the related parties while entering into the transaction. This analysis is in short called as FAR analysis. This is the most crucial part of any transfer pricing analysis that is to be done between any of the methods. This analysis is required for accurate transfer pricing analysis, for determining the most reliable method that can be applied to the transaction, and for selecting the comparable companies to a transaction. So what exactly is this functions perform asset central risk assumed analysis? We we have provided an illustrative FAR analysis for various kinds of taxpayers. We have a manufacturer over here who is full-fledged into manufacturing of goods. We have a full risk distributor operating in UAE, which is acting as a full-fledged trader of goods. And we have a limited risk distributor entity operating in UAE, which is ensured of a fixed profit margin by the related parties. So, in case if the limited risk distributor is earning profits higher than that fixed profit margin, the profits would be pulled back by the related parties out of UAE through certain adjustments. And if in case the limited risk distributor is making losses, the related parties would recoup those losses to the limited risk distributor. So when we look at the functions performed by each of these entities, let's take on first the manufacturing activities. The manufacturing activities would be essentially undertaken by the manufacturer, a full risk distributor, or a trader, or a limited risk distributor will not undertake manufacturing activities. Procurement of raw materials, it would be again attributable only to the manufacturer, since the manufacturer has to procure the raw materials and manufacture goods. Full risk distributor or a limited risk distributor won't undertake the procurement of raw materials. Inventory management, yes, it would be done by the manufacturer and a full risk distributor both. A limited risk distributor would maintain inventory to the extent of the orders that it has on hand. Marketing activities, again, the manufacturer would be undertaking full-fledged marketing entities, whereas a manufacturer as well as the full risk distributor both would be undertaking full risk marketing activity, whereas a limited risk distributor is not required to undertake a full-fledged marketing. Logistics, yes, all the three entities would be involved into logistics function. And collection from customers, yes, all the three forms of businesses would be involved into collection from business and collection from customers. Moving on to the next part, we have the risks assumed analysis for all the three kinds of businesses. So market risk is the risk of going bankrupt in the market tomorrow if there doesn't exist any market for this particular business time. This risk is being faced, would be faced by all the manufacturer, food risk distributor, and limited risk distributor, all the kinds of businesses. Product liability risk is the risk arising out of a defective product, which would be solely attributable to the manufacturer only. In case of a trader, a limited risk distributor, or a full risk distributor, the customers would, though the customers would approach these entities in case of any product default, but ultimately the liability to compensate the losses arising out of the product, defective product, would be passed on to the manufacturer, and hence the full risk distributor and limited risk distributor do not undertake any product liability risk. Credit and collection risk. This risk is borne by all the three forms of business entities. Foreign exchange risk. Foreign exchange risk is inherent in case of cross-border transactions when the transactions are not undertaken in the functional or the base currency of a particular country. IP infringement risk. The intellectual infringement risk would be with the entity who is the holder of the intellectual property. So, in our case, a manufacturer would possess technical know-how or technical acumen to manufacture the goods, and hence the IP infringement risk would be attributable only to the manufacturer, whereas food risk distributor and limited risk distributor do not have any IP infringement risk on them. The next is the assets employed analysis for all the three entities. A factory would be employed by a manufacturer to manufacture the products, whereas a factory is not required in case of a food waste distributor or limited waste distributor. Office building, yes, it would be employed by all the three uh, business firms. Employees also, it would be employed by all the three business firms. Technical know-how would be with the manufacturer only, and food waste distributor and food waste distributor do not have any technical know-how in place for their business operations. And warehousing facilities, yes, all the three of them would be having it for conducting their business. So this is how, based on the FAR analysis, based on the functions performed, risk assumed, and assets employed, an analysis of the arms and price has to be done to determine the correct arms and price and to ensure compliance to the transfer pricing. FAR analysis is very crucial in determining the comparable transactions for which you or a business entity would be selecting to determine the arms and price, and this is considered to be a heart of transfer pricing analysis. So now we have transfer pricing documentation. Article 55 of the corporate tax law provides that certain taxpayers are required to provide a complete disclosure as a part of their corporate tax return, and the disclosure is with respect to the transactions that they have undertaken with the related or connected parties. The form may require details such as, which are required to undertake the arms and analysis for the transactions taken between related and connected parties. However, the details are yet to be notified by the federal tax authorities. Certain taxpayers are also required to maintain and file master file and local file documentation based on that prescribed with the OECD guidelines. So, what is the impact of transfer pricing on business? Business entities would be required to undertake the following analysis to understand the impact of transfer pricing. The first one is identification of the related or connected parties within the group, identification of the transactions that are subject to transfer pricing, and analyzing whether these transactions are at arm's length or not, revisiting the supply chain within the group to undertake review of intercompany documents, whether they are maintained and documented properly. Generally, till date, for the taxpayers operating in UAE, there was no tax applicable to them. Hence, there would be number of taxpayers without any proper agreement, intercompany agreement documented or maintained from a tax perspective, which needs to be now in place in order to determine what will be the correct arm's length price of a transaction. And the last one would be distribution of the transaction flow to be in compliance with the transfer pricing regulations of the UAE. So, how Parish can help in transfer pricing compliances and advisory? So under the transfer pricing compliances, Barish can help you in identification of related parties and connected parties, identification and analysis of the transactions that would be covered under the UE transfer pricing regime, undertake transfer pricing analysis for the covered transactions and determine their arms and price, and assist your businesses with regular transfer pricing compliances, disclosure form, master file, local file, and CBC report. Under the transfer pricing advisory, Parish can advise you on a suitable transfer pricing model and setting out a transfer pricing policy for intercompany transactions. Parish can help you in implementation of transfer pricing policy and undertake periodic review of the operating margin earned to be in compliance with the AMS analysis as provided under the UAE transparency regime, assisting in review or drafting of the intercompany agreements for the transactions subject to transfer pricing. Berish can also help you in restructuring your supply chain, which would be required for to ensure that the transactions are being undertaken at arm's length. And Berish can also advise you on intra-group services, management charges, royalty payments, cost contribution arrangements, or financing transactions, and determine the arm's length price for this kind of transactions, or determine the transfer pricing policies for this kind of complex transactions. So, with this, we move towards the end of the presentation. Thank you for your patience listening. If you have any questions, please post it in the chat box and we will answer your questions. It seems there are no questions. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for a patient listening.